The unfinished portrait, the afternoon light streaming through the windows of seashore. Memory's photography studio cast everything in golden hues, the kind of light Maya Chun had learned to chase during her years behind the camera. She adjusted the angle of her tripod for the third time, studying the Henderson family arranged before her. Mother, father, and twin boys who couldn't seem to stop fidgeting despite their parents' gentle warnings. Just a few more shots, Maya promised, her voice carrying the practiced patience she'd developed over countless sessions. 3 years of running her own studio had taught her that the perfect family portrait required equal parts technical skill and endless persistence. Tommy, can you look right here at the camera? Perfect. The coastal town of Millbrook moved at its own unhurried pace, especially on Tuesday afternoons, when the summer tourists had thinned and locals reclaimed their quiet streets. Maya had chosen this timing deliberately when she'd moved here, seeking the kind of predictable rhythm that her previous life had never offered. No surprises, no sudden disappearances, just the steady click of her shutter and the satisfaction of capturing moments that families would treasure forever. She was framing the final shot when she heard it, the soft creak of her studio door opening despite the session in progress. Sign hanging outside. Through her viewfinder, she caught a glimpse of small sneakers and the hem of a yellow sundress. "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Henderson whispered, noticing the interruption. Someone's little one must have wandered in. Maya lowered her camera, ready to gently redirect the lost child, but found herself frozen mid-movement. A little girl, no more than 4 years old, stood just inside the doorway with her thumb in her mouth and impossibly green eyes that Maya recognized with a clarity that made her chest tighten. Those eyes belonged in her memory, attached to a face she'd worked years to forget. "Sophie, there you are." A woman's voice called from outside, followed by hurried footsteps. Elena Torres appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath, her dark hair escaping from its ponytail. She stopped, short when she saw Maya, her expression shifting from relief to something more complicated, recognition mixed with old pain. "I'm sorry," Elena said quietly, reaching for the little girl's hand. "She slipped away while I was talking to Mrs. Patterson next door. Sophie, we need to go." But Sophie had wandered deeper into the studio, drawn to the collection of framed photographs covering one wall. She pointed at a black and white image of the Millbrook Lighthouse, taken during a storm Maya had captured last winter. "That's where Daddy's boat sleeps," Sophie announced to no one in particular, her small voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. Maya's hands trembled as she set down her camera. The Henderson family sat forgotten in their posed arrangement, sensing the shift in atmosphere, but not understanding its source. Elena's face had gone pale, her grip tightening on her purse strap. "Sophie, honey, we really need to leave now," Elena repeated, but her eyes remained fixed on Maya's face, as if seeing a ghost she'd hoped never to encounter again. "You're the pretty lady from Mommy's pictures," Sophie said, walking directly to Maya with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Elena showed me pictures of you and Daddy together. You were wearing a really pretty white dress." The words hit Maya like cold water, bringing back memories of dress fittings and flower arrangements, of a day that had started with such hope and ended in humiliation, so complete she'd left everything behind and started over in this quiet coastal town where nobody knew her story, where nobody knew about David Torres or the wedding that never happened. Echoes in the harbor. The Henderson family left with their proofs and promises to return, but Maya barely registered their departure. She stood motionless in her studio, staring at the empty space where Sophie had been pointing at the lighthouse. Photograph. Elena remained by the door, her daughter now quiet beside her, sensing the weight of adult emotions she couldn't yet understand. "She doesn't know, does she?" Maya finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. About what happened between David and me. Elena shook her head slowly. She knows her daddy went away before she was born, that his boat got caught in a storm, and he didn't come back. I show her pictures sometimes, so she knows his face, but I never mentioned. She trailed off, glancing down at Sophie, who was now examining a vintage camera Maya kept on display. You don't have to explain anything to me, Maya said, though. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She moved to the window overlooking Millbrook's small harbor, where fishing boats bobbed peacefully in the afternoon sun. I left town. I had no right to know about his life after. Maya, Elena's voice carried years of regret. David never knew about Sophie. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after the Coast Guard called off the search. The revelation struck Maya like a physical blow. She'd spent 3 years believing David had simply chosen to walk away from their life together, that somewhere he was living happily while she rebuilt herself from the ashes of their abandoned wedding plans. Learning he was dead should have brought closure, but instead it opened wounds she thought had healed. The storm hit the night before your wedding, Helena continued, moving closer. David had gone out on his sailboat. You know how he always did that when he was nervous or excited. The harbor master said the wind picked up suddenly around midnight. Maya remembered that night with painful clarity. She'd been unable to sleep, running through last-minute details and imagining their life together, while she'd been choosing between 2 shades of lipstick. David had been fighting for his life against the churning Atlantic. They found the boat 3 days later, Helena said, her voice growing thick, capsized near the lighthouse. His life jacket was still on board, but David ... She stopped, glancing at Sophie, who was now humming softly to herself while tracing patterns on the camera lens. I waited for him to come back, Maya whispered. At the church, in my dress, for 2 hours. I thought he'd changed his mind, that he'd realized he didn't love me enough. Elena's eyes filled with tears. He loved you desperately, Maya. Those last few weeks, he talked about nothing but starting your life together. He bought that sailboat because he wanted to teach your future children to sail. Sophie wandered back to them, tugging on Elena's sleeve. Mama, why are you sad? Is the pretty lady sad too? Elena knelt down to Sophie's level, smoothing her dark hair. Sometimes grown-ups get sad when they remember people they miss, sweetheart. Like when I miss Daddy? Sophie asked with the innocent wisdom that children possessed. Yes, exactly like that. Maya watched this exchange with a mixture of heartbreak and something else, a strange sense of connection to this child who carried David's eyes and his sister's gentle spirit. Sophie looked up at her with those familiar green eyes and smiled. Do you miss my daddy too? She asked Maya directly. The question hung in the air like morning mist over the harbor. Maya found herself kneeling beside Elena, meeting Sophie at eye level. Yes, sweetheart, I miss him very much. Sophie nodded solemnly, then surprised them both by wrapping her small arms around Maya's neck in a spontaneous hug. It's okay to be sad, she whispered with 4-year-old authority. Elena says Daddy watches over us from the lighthouse now. Over Sophie's shoulder, Maya met Elena's eyes and saw her own grief reflected there, not just for David, but for all the might-have-beens that his death had stolen from them. A wedding that became a funeral. A marriage that became mourning. A family that might have included this beautiful little girl, who now carried the best parts of the man they both loved. The stranger at the lighthouse 2 weeks after Sophie's unexpected visit, Maya found herself photographing the lighthouse more frequently, drawn to its weathered stone walls and the way morning fog clung to its base. She told herself it was purely artistic interest, but the truth was more complicated. Every time she looked through her viewfinder at the spot where David's boat had been found, she felt closer to understanding what his final moments might have been like. She was adjusting. Her telephoto lens on a particularly gray Thursday morning when footsteps crunched on the gravel path behind her. Maya turned to find a man in his 30s watching her work, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a worn leather jacket. There was something unsettling about his stillness, the way he seemed to be studying not just her, but the lighthouse itself, with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Beautiful morning for photography," he said, his voice carrying a slight rasp, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Maya nodded politely, but didn't lower her camera. "The light's perfect just after sunrise. Are you visiting Millbrook?" "Something like that." He stepped closer, and she noticed his eyes were an unusual shade of blue-gray, like storm clouds over the ocean. "I'm James. James Miller. I've been staying at the bed and breakfast in town for a few weeks now. Maya Chun. I run the photography studio on Harbor Street." She finally lowered her camera, though something about the stranger made her want to keep the lens between them as protection. James nodded toward the lighthouse. "Do you know much about its history?" "I've been trying to piece together some information about this area. It's been guiding ships safely to harbor for over a century," Maya replied carefully. "Though sometimes even lighthouses can't prevent tragedies." Something flickered across James's face. Recognition, perhaps, or pain. Tragedies? "A few years ago, a local man was lost in a storm near here. His boat was found, but he never was." Maya studied James's reaction, noting how his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That must have been difficult for his family. It was. Maya packed her camera equipment slowly, reluctant to leave, but increasingly uncomfortable with the strangers. Probing questions. "His sister still lives in town. She has a little daughter who asks about her father sometimes." James went very still. "A daughter?" "Sophie. She's 4 now. Sweet child, looks just like—" Maya stopped herself. Something about the way James was staring at her made her realize she was sharing too much personal information with a complete stranger. Over the following days, James became a regular presence around town. Maya spotted him at the diner where she grabbed her morning coffee, browsing the small bookstore next to her studio, always alone but watching everything with those storm-colored eyes. When he appeared at her studio door the following Tuesday, she wasn't entirely surprised. "I'd like to commission some photographs," he said without preamble. Maya gestured him inside, noting how he moved carefully, as if certain movements caused him pain. "What kind of photographs are you looking for?" "Memory work," James said, then seemed to search for better words. "I'm trying to reconstruct some lost time. I thought perhaps if I had images of familiar places, it might help trigger recollections." It was an unusual request, but Maya had learned that photography served many purposes beyond simple documentation. "Have you experienced memory loss?" James nodded, touching his temple unconsciously. "An accident. The doctors say some memories may return with the right stimulus." He pulled out a thick envelope of cash. "I can pay well for your discretion and patience." Something about his desperation reminded Maya of her own need to rebuild after trauma. "What kinds of places would you like photographed?" "The harbor at different times of day. The lighthouse, especially during storms if possible. Local restaurants, shops, anywhere someone might go on a regular basis." James paused, then added quietly, "And if you happen to photograph any families around town, I'd appreciate copies of those as well." The request sent a chill down Maya's spine, but she told herself she was being paranoid. Memory loss after an accident was a legitimate medical condition, and photography therapy wasn't unheard of. "I'll need a few days to plan the shoots," she said finally. "Of course." James headed toward the door, then turned back. "Maya? That little girl you mentioned, Sophie. Does she come around here often?" Every protective instinct Maya possessed flared to life. "Why do you ask?" "I thought I saw her the other day, playing near the lighthouse." It seems dangerous for a child so young to be unsupervised near the water. Her aunt watches her carefully, Maya said firmly. Sophie is very safe in this town. James nodded and left, but Maya immediately called Elena, warning her about the stranger asking questions about Sophie. What she didn't mention was the growing certainty that James Miller was not who he claimed to be, and that his interest in David's family was far from coincidental. When the tide returns, Maya's hands shook as she developed the photographs in her darkroom, the red light casting everything in shades of blood and shadow. She'd spent the week following James around town with her telephoto lens, capturing him. At the lighthouse, at the harbor, studying his face and profile, and straight-on shots. Something about his bone structure nagged at her, a familiarity she couldn't place until she pulled the contact sheets from the developer bath. There, in black and white, was the truth she'd been too afraid to see in person, the scar along his hairline was barely visible, and his face was thinner, weathered by time and trauma. But the angle of his jaw, the way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right, these were details carved into her memory from 1,000 shared mornings. From engagement photos she'd kept hidden in a box under her bed for 3 years. James Miller was David Torres. Maya's legs gave out, and she sank onto the darkroom stool, staring at the photographs spread before her. David was alive. David, who she'd mourned, who she'd blamed, who she'd tried desperately to forget, was walking around Millbrook asking questions about his own family while claiming to be someone else. The darkroom door burst open, flooding the space with harsh fluorescent light and ruining the photographs still in the developer. Elena stood silhouetted in the doorway, Sophie's small hand clutched in hers. "Maya, we need to talk. Now." Elena's voice was tight with panic. "That man, James Miller? Sophie saw him at the playground today and said something that made my blood run cold. Elena, I need to tell you something. She said he smells like Daddy." Elena stepped into the ruined dark room, her eyes wild. Not that he smells good like her daddy might have, but that he actually smells like David, like the cologne David wore, like the soap he used. Sophie has been carrying around one of his old shirts for 3 years. She knows that scent better than anyone. Maya looked down at Sophie, who was studying the scattered photographs with interest. The little girl picked up one of the clearest shots of James in profile and held it up to the light. "That's the nice man from the playground," Sophie announced. Then, with the matter-of-fact tone that only children possessed, she added, "He looks like Daddy when Daddy was sad." The two women stared at each other over Sophie's head, the impossible truth settling between them like dust after an explosion. "The accident," Maya whispered. "Elena, what if he didn't die in that storm? What if he was hurt, maybe washed up somewhere else, and he's been living with amnesia for 3 years while we mourned him?" Elena finished, her voice cracking. "While I raised his daughter alone, and you rebuilt your entire life?" Sophie dropped the photograph and wrapped her arms around Elena's legs. "Why are you scared, Mama? The nice man is friendly. He bought me ice cream and asked about my favorite games." Elena's face went white. "He talked to you? Sophie, what did you tell him?" "Just about my toys and how I live with you because my daddy had to go away before I was born. He seemed really sad when I told him that." Sophie looked between the two adults with growing concern. "Did I say something wrong?" Maya knelt beside Sophie, her mind racing. If David was alive but had no memory of his past, approaching him incorrectly could be dangerous, not just emotionally, but medically. But they couldn't let him continue wandering around town, potentially putting himself or Sophie at risk. "Sophie, sweetie," Maya said gently, "next time you see the nice man, don't talk to him alone, okay? Always make sure Elena or I are with you. Is he a bad man?" Sophie asked, her green eyes, David's eyes, wide with worry. Elena knelt on Sophie's other side, her voice carefully controlled. No, honey, he's not bad. But grown-ups sometimes need help remembering important things, and we want to make sure we help him the right way. Sophie nodded solemnly, then surprised them both by picking up another photograph of James. She studied it for a long moment before looking up at Maya. He has Daddy's eyes, too, she said simply, but they look lost. Maya felt tears she'd held back for years finally spill over. David was lost, not dead, but lost in the worst possible way. He was looking for himself without even knowing what he was seeking. And somewhere in his damaged mind, he was drawn to the daughter he'd never met and the life he couldn't remember losing. The question now was whether they could help him find his way back without destroying the fragile peace they'd all built in his absence. Developing the future, Maya found David at the lighthouse as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He stood at the edge of the rocks where his boat had been found 3 years ago, his hands pressed against the weathered stone, as if trying to absorb memories from its surface. The headaches are getting worse, he said without turning around. Ever since I started coming here, I see flashes of things that feel real but make no sense. A woman in a white dress, a little girl with my eyes, a life that should be mine but isn't. Maya approached slowly, her heart hammering. David. He turned at the sound of his real name, and she saw recognition flicker across his face like lightning. You know who I am. I know who you were. She pulled out one of their old engagement photos, the edges worn from years of handling. I'm Maya. We were going to be married the day after the storm. David stared at the photograph, his fingers trembling as he traced their younger faces. The woman in white. You were waiting for me. For 2 hours. In the church. I thought you'd changed your mind. I would never. He stopped, pressing his palm against his forehead. I remember sailing, being excited about tomorrow. Then the wind, the waves, ... His voice broke. I remember wanting to come home to you. Footsteps on the path made them both turn. Elena appeared with Sophie, who broke free and ran toward them with 4-year-old fearlessness. Daddy! Sophie launched herself at David, who caught her instinctively, his face crumbling as suppressed memories flooded back. My little girl, he whispered, and Maya knew in that moment that some bonds transcended memory. That love lived deeper than conscious thought. Elena approached cautiously. The Coast Guard found you 3 days after the storm. You'd washed up 2 towns over with a severe head injury. The hospital there had no idea who you were. I've been living as James Miller for 3 years, David said, still holding Sophie. Close, working odd jobs, getting treatment, always feeling like I was looking for something I couldn't name. Sophie pulled back to study his face with serious eyes. Are you going to go away again? Never, David promised, then looked at Maya with uncertainty. If you'll have me, if we can find a way back to each other. Maya watched him with their daughter, his daughter, and felt the last walls around her heart crumble. This wasn't the life they'd planned, but it was the life they'd been given. Broken and mended, lost and found, but real. We'll figure it out, she said simply. All of us together. As twilight settled over Millbrook, Maya taught David how to hold a camera again, his muscle memory returning as naturally as breathing. Through her viewfinder, she captured the first photograph of their unexpected family. Imperfect, complicated, but finally complete. Some stories, she realized, were worth the wait.